This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Pedro Reyes. Reyes has garnered international acclaim for his large-scale projects that address current social and political issues, including gun control and nuclear nonproliferation. Although he describes himself as a sculptor, his varied practice utilizes performance, video, design, and activism. He utilizes his artwork to explore the power of individuals and collective organizations to create change through communication, creativity, happiness, and humor. And now, a conversation about art as a vehicle for change with artist Pedro Reyes. Reyes, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Pedro, with artists, I usually like to start with a hypothetical, which is, say you're at a dinner party next to someone who has absolutely no idea who you are or what your work consists of. Where do you start to explain to them what it is?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that I'm a sculptor. And I think that sculptor, or what sculpture does, is to change the shape of things. So my practice often, I think of all of it as sculpture, but there's mainly two main categories, which is the social sculpture, which is these projects that are social practice, and then sculpture, no, which is more classical take on three-dimensional objects, and but both of them inform each other and they're connected. So the first one, which is the social practice, is participatory and political and community driven. And then the classical sculpture is more kind of a formal investigation on where I channel a lot of sources from past and present. So that often takes the form of stone carvings or other materials. That would be a short answer.
There's overlap there because there are parts of your artistic practice that I guess would be categorized as using legislative theater. And then there are other parts of your practice where you're still pursuing maybe some of the same social issues, but doing it in a more tangible, three-dimensional, artistic form, correct? Mm-hmm. But what are those issues that are more commonly at the heart of the social impact you're hoping to make?
Well, I think that a lot of my work maybe is connected with pacifism. That's why I've been working, for instance, with small arms, like melting guns that they're made into shovels to plant trees, or taking guns to make musical instruments. One example could be this arm where I took 7,000 weapons and made them into different kind of full orchestras of instruments of all kinds, percussion, wind, string instruments. So I would take, for instance, a shotgun or a rifle and drill holes in it to turn that into a flute. And that's like an example of changing the shape and use and function of an object. Like direct metal is like technique where you don't cast, but like actually take these kind of pieces of discarded metal. There's even a term for that they call it trench art. Like a kind of but so that's something that is there's a sculptural approach, because you have to make some like a violin or a guitar out of these gun parts, But there's also this social dimension, which is effectively removing these weapons from circulation. And hopefully those weapons that are not, I mean, like effectively, they are never going to be able to kill anyone, no? So that's why I'm very much interested in this kind of a intervention in society, but also the making of an object which is a catalyzer of a certain social undertaking.
In Palas por Pistolas, in that project, you were taking the confiscated firearms and they were melted down and transformed into shovels and distributed around the world and used for digging holes to plant trees. And in that case, there was this transformation where you really wouldn't necessarily know the history of the object, versus with this arm, you know exactly what this item used to be, right?
And like this kind of working with arms have kind of something that have continued to evolve. Earlier this year, I had a show in New Mexico at Site Santa Fe, and Brandy Caoba, the curator of the show, called me and told me that there was someone in New Mexico who had replicated my project. Her name is Miranda Viscoli, and she wanted to meet me. And I said, of course, like I was very, very, very happy that someone had taken inspiration from Palas por Pistolas. And she was doing something called Guns to Gardens, where she started to melt guns to make small shovels. And I said to Miranda, we should do a collaboration. And we came up with a beautiful project that we call Memento, where we went with high school students and organized a welding shop. And the students would take gun parts and make a flower base. Like a rifle would be like the kind of like somehow like the holder for the flower, and then other pieces like the chamber or something, other parts from guns would kind of help keep it standing. And then we made with the students 30 of these that were made available for purchase, going for $1,500. And there was a reason for that, because Miranda organizes a gun buyback program where if someone brings a gun to her, she gives them a gift card for $150.
Wow.
And if they bring a semi-automatic gun, it's a gift card for $250. So we were turning these gun parts into flower vases, and for every gun base that was sold, 100% of the proceeds went to gift cards. So by buying this object, you are effectively removing 10 guns from the streets. And that's what I think that's when the sculpture becomes really social sculpture, no? Because you are somehow connecting a number of agents in the world, like kind of the students, the principal from the school that organized the workshop, the museum, the organization from Miranda, which is called New Mexicans for Gun Violence Prevention. And all these are components of the social sculpture. And there's a kind of it's almost like permaculture, no? Like a system where, we were creating objects from gun parts that were removing more guns from circulation and becoming new bases. So it's a kind of like a cycle of turning this agent of death into an agent of life.
It's transformation, right? And I know that psychological transformation is, I feel like, one of the goals in your work. And I know your work typically engages viewers in a dialogue about change, but people aren't always looking for change, right? They're adverse to change oftentimes. What things do you consider in your creative process to try to overcome the emotional roadblocks that viewers might have?
Well, it's interesting. There's different kind of social scientists that have tried to create a path or roadmap to produce change. Kurt Lewin, who was a social scientist, said that you had like three phases. One was to unfreeze a situation and then introduce a change and then lock up that new configuration of elements. No, so I think that is very important that to acknowledge that you to produce change you have to first kind of do a sort of warm up for people to get into the to be receptive to a new configuration. No? So it depends on what is it that you hope to change, but I think that there's like, for instance, like game or play is a sort of warm up that can help to introduce changes. Right now, for instance, I'm making a documentary about nuclear disarmament. And I realized that the subject is very heavy, like not a lot of people want to hear about the end of the world. It's a downer. So what I've been doing is to tell the story of how nuclear war have been portrayed in movies, in cinema, as well as in songs and art. So it's the documentary is I'm working on is more like if you had kind of a walk by accident into a film analysis class where we're discussing film, and it's through the history of film that I'm then, it's like the Trojan horse to talk about what is fallout, what is nuclear winter, what is, mutually assured destruction, and all these concepts that are treated through art. So, I believe that actually art can be a very good gateway to talk about these things that we don't want to talk about. And where I'm saying, well, there's this and this song that maybe you have heard all your life, and you're doing, a workout while you hear them, and you maybe you haven't realized that they're actually talking about nuclear war. So that that's just to say an example of this kind of a decoy or Trojan horse that sometimes is art can be like that way to lure people into these heavy subjects.
I've heard you talk about how your training was as an architect, and that being an architect is all about problem solving, whereas sometimes art for art's sake is something else. I mean, is that something you struggle with, is always feeling like as a social art practice, you are constantly thinking about new ideas and ways to solve that social problem?
Art for art's sake is, like the uselessness of art is where most of its use relies. No, I think that art is a sort of food for the soul. So if we were only to hear protest songs, would be horrible. I think that is, and I enjoy making and also I enjoy art for art's sake, made by other artists. And I always say that artists don't break rules, that artists add extra rules upon themselves. So, I think that if I want some of my pieces to fulfill some social role, it's just a rule that I impose on myself, but I don't think that is how art should be. It's just an aspiration that I have, and not even for all my work, just for a part of my work. I believe that that also some people may be cynical and say, well, art cannot produce real change. I think that possibility should not be canceled. If you want to try for art to kind of contribute to a intervention, even if it's a kind of a domestic or small scale, it can perform that way.
Let me ask you a different question. I've heard you say that curating provided the training that you needed to become an artist. I see that some of your current work is kind of responding to maybe some shows that you've curated recently. Can you talk about the influence of curation and that process, and how it's, influenced your thought process and your work and how you see your role as an artist?
Of course, yeah, no, what you say is very true. I think that oftentimes art making is a sort of education, or how would you call it? Like an opportunity for one to research. For instance, last year I curated this show called Monumental, which was about the history of public art and sculpture in 20th century in Mexico. And I needed to curate this show. It was mainly of historical artwork, but I was able to conduct a number of interviews with senior artists that have been practicing since the 40s. And it was very important for me to understand two big schools that were in opposition, like kind of in the first half of the century, you had the nationalistic art that is, like the generation of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and Siqueiros, Orozco, etc. And then from the 50s, 60s, you have La Ruptura, which is this kind of artist that wanted to do abstraction and other art that was, and they were one against each other. And I think that, like myself, I grew up in the 90s kind of not really knowing why we felt kind of a certain rejection to nationalistic art, to that what kind of what in the United States called the Mexican Renaissance. And doing these interviews, it was very important for me because I understood that there were different things. Like the problem with nationalism is that after the Second World War, nationalism becomes a toxic concept because it became a synonym of imperialism, colonialism, supremacism, racism, fascism. But I was looking at the work that from the Mexican Renaissance, and there's actually nothing to be ashamed of. They were celebrating indigenous cultures and socialist revolution, and there's nothing to be ashamed of there. So I think that what happened was that we sort of internalized European guilt because there was like this big exodus of European artists that come to the American continent, and there's like this kind of big act of regret because it was thought that like nationalism was a cause for all the tragedies of the Second World War, and I think that there's like a kind of also another factor, no, which was this generational a kind of a conflict between the artists from the Mexican Renaissance were not only very famous inside Mexico but worldwide, so they were like gods almost, and the younger artists wanted to just like take them down from their pedestals, so they were very, very viciously attacked, and the both parts were against each other. The nationalists would say, "Oh, you are being brainwashed by the CIA and McCarthyism," and the artists from La Ruptura would say, not everything that there is to paint is peasants and cactuses. We want freedom and we want to kind of be able to do any kind of art. I believe that now in the 21st century, this is like kind of a thesis and antithesis, and art history would be at a loss if you had to pick one of these two schools. Actually, a lot of my work is a negotiation where I'm creating a kind of synthesis of these two approaches, because I'm kind of all the time channeling a lot of ancient references and elements from pre-Columbian art or from popular crafts or etc. While at the same time navigating the conceptual framework of this late modern post-war art. No, so I think that for me it was very important to create this show to understand that it was not one or the other, but that actually that kind of a coming to terms with these two opposing schools and befriending them in my mind somehow, if that makes any sense.
You're serving kind of as a conduit between these two ideologies. How does that manifest itself in this latest work that you've created that's on display now, the monumentality?
Well, like monuments, I think that are under attack, no, in our present moment, and many deserve that, like obviously, because they are monuments to oppressors, or maybe they're of poor artistic quality. However, like in the research, in the kind of when I was doing this exhibition, like I was looking at, because what is most studied is the painting from the muralists, but I was looking at the sculpture made in that same period, and what was done there was the civic sculpture. That is, like all these monuments that were done to, but like the monuments that were done in Mexico at that time, they were not monuments to settlers or to oppressors. There were monuments done to Cuauhtémoc or Nezahualcóyotl, like these kind of ancient rulers from the Aztec world, or peasants, or etc. So that's why, like I think that despite the fact that is unfashionable and kind of people would say, why are you defending monuments? All monuments should go. I was saying, no, wait a minute. I mean, like, it's important for a country that is coming out of a colonial period, because we experienced 300 years of colonial rule from Spain, like that you have to affirm your identity as a country, and it's not the same to have like kind of a statue of Columbus, or that to have like a statue of Cuauhtémoc, like I mean, like you can actually take pride in this kind of monuments that were erected to honor the cultures of the past, or the socialist, the revolution from 1910. So in a way, like I think that even though the critical environment, I felt that I was kind of venturing into something that was kind of against the trend today. I think that trend is very much dominated by the academia in the United States, and that sometimes there's kind of conclusions that you derive because they're kind of maybe the critique of monuments is based on the Confederate statues or these monuments that I 100% agree that they should go, but not every single kind of public sculpture in the world would be under that have that problematic. So I was trying to kind of actually kind of argue that we should become more sophisticated in our judgment to try to reconcile with that idea of monumentality. I mean, like, I've been working with stone carvers, and these stone carvers, they're grandsons from the masons and sculptors that made these monuments in that revolutionary period. And I was very much interested in keeping this trade alive, because stone carving is something that has disappeared around the world, mainly because now it's done by robots. So when you introduce a robot into a manufacturing process, 6 persons lose their job. And around the world, that profession has been disappearing, and my studio has become a sort of school where senior stone carvers started to train people who started in the studio 3 years ago, and now they have learned this trade. And I am very much interested in kind of a little bit like a medieval or old-fashioned studio where you go into a kind of a art studio, and then you learn this, and then you maybe graduate from the studio and then kind of set up your own business or your own practice. But I'm interested in this transmission of intergenerational art making, very much focused on a particular technique, no? So like, it took me some time to arrive to these conclusions, because when I started, like I felt like a very strong call to work this way. But at first, it seemed like a sort of betrayal to this kind of conceptual framework that I started working, because, like when I started working, I think that for instance, like social practice is a kind of a late development in the dematerialization of art, like kind of the idea of social sculpture is, like a kind of a sculpture dematerializes and then leads to the social, like through performances and things like that. So why I was like suddenly like called to work with this way, and I think that there's an element of resilience in I kind of have a sort of esoteric or superstition belief that like a stone carving earns its place in eternity. Like if something has been stone carved, then no one will throw it away as trash, because regardless if they don't remember who made it, I think that there's something about it that may kind of it may emanate a desire to just for that object to be cherished by others. So I don't know. It's very, maybe very romantic, but I mean, like, I think that even it seems like kind of the most conservative or more formalistic approach to do this classical sculpture, that there's invisible dimension that is also social practice inside my making.
You're describing this classical sculpture as maybe it doesn't look like other contemporary work, but I feel like a lot of times people can't help but appreciate the amount of work that goes into a particular piece. I'll talk to painters that will do things in their paintings that are incredibly meticulous, and it's obvious that it took them hundreds of hours to do. And it's a way for people to be invited in to slow down and ask themselves, what's going on? Why did he care so much? And I think the same can be said, when you go to Egypt and you see an 80-foot tall sculpture of a king, you're asking yourself, why did they care so much? It's obviously so labor intensive. So I think it does open the door for a dialogue in terms of, just by the nature of the sheer amount of work that goes into that sort of thing, will ask people to stop and ask why, won't it?
I can relate to that. Yes, I think that is true, because also when you are doing this manual work, you are making thousands of small decisions. Like you're thinking by doing, and so as much as it is a physical work, it is also a conceptual work, where like all the aggregate of all those decisions creates a unified impression on the viewer.
I know that when you're working with stone in particular, it's not like you're casting this with cement or plaster or whatever. Stone has a mind of its own, right? And so, when you're working with these apprentices, are you there hands-on having to make those decisions on how to deal with how the stone is fighting back?
Yes, there's often surprises that are not necessarily welcome because, maybe you're working on a stone and then you find like a big bubble or a kind of a piece of bone that was like inside, or something that is like a fault or a crack or something that will compromise the stability of the piece, and then you have to start over or work your way around it. And also, I mean, sometimes you also have to let some of the stone do the work for you, and only work on the stone as little as you can. This is actually something that Noguchi would say. And that's how he, this is something that I'm trying to kind of explain, because the thing is that, for instance, if you were to do a kind of a carving with a robot, it's like a little bit like cooking with a microwave. Like you have a design and then you press a button and then you let the machine do their work. But if you're doing the stone by carving, sometimes you leave part of the stone without work because there's a plasticity of the stone itself that you want to be there. And actually, a lot of the kind of decisions that the artist may do is to decide how little can you work to let the work do its part.
The show that's currently up at Listen Gallery in LA, what will people see when they come to visit that show?
There's I think that there's 10 sculptures in display. Some are abstract, some are figurative, some are in between. I think that there's certain sculptures that perhaps are more connected with some of my social practice. For instance, there's this standing figure called a moshkali, which means library in Nahuatl, the original language from the Valley of Mexico, and this is related to Tlaquilo, which is a kind of initiative that I have about activating libraries, and I also turn my personal library into a public library. And every day there's someone who rings my bell and they take whatever they want. So when I'm walking through my living room, there's someone there, and they're just like kind of browsing through the stacks and taking like books, and they bring them back 2 or 3 months later. And I wanted, perhaps to go back to the idea of this civic sculpture. For instance, I wanted to, I think that the role of how sculpture would help you identify a building or vocation of a building, of an institution of sorts. So I created like this kind of standing figure that is like holding a book, and that's, for instance, connected with this social practice project, which is the library. There's an Instagram account called Tlaquilo Biblioteca that we actually manage the loans through the Instagram account. So when someone picks some books, we made a photograph of the books they're taking, and that's kind of kept in our conversation in the messages, and that's how we operate, which is a minimal, like a very kind of a simple system of control. But we or another sculpture, for instance, called the treaty, it's kind of two hands like this
Mm-hmm.
holding each other, and this is a piece that for me it's kind of a allegory of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I'm currently working with ICANN, which is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. That is that they won the Peace Nobel Prize in 2017 because they created this treaty that there will be a meeting of state parties in November at the United Nations in New York. And the treaty has been endorsed by 95 countries so far. Mm-hmm. So half of the planet have endorsed the treaty. But it's interesting because, what does it mean to do this treaty? The treaty means that if you sign the treaty, as a country, you adopt this kind of you commit to never develop or let anyone have nuclear weapons in your territory or use any kind of nuclear weapons. So it's only binding for the countries that decide to sign the treaty. And most progress have done, those 95 countries that have signed the treaty are mostly countries in Latin America, Africa, Scandinavia, certain countries that have banned nuclear weapons, and that it doesn't mean that the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons will sign the treaty ever, or but at least there's something that is being done, and I like this idea that most progress is happening from the global south, because change has to come from somewhere, and that's where it's coming from so far. So that's perhaps why this kind of idea of the hands that are holding each other are a symbol of a kind of more like, it's not like the rising fist of that is a single one. It's like kind of a two together, and the idea that you need to have this kind of synergy of parties. And so, I mean, like, you see the sculpture, and maybe all this explanation is not gonna be evident at all. You could derive any other meaning from it. But in my mind, when I'm doing these works, the other projects that I'm working at the same time inform my choice of subject, and that's where I decide to do these allegories. I like the idea of sculpture in the very old-fashioned way of, okay, well, how do you represent justice? Is blindfolded with a scale, or freedom with a torch, etc. So I like this old-fashioned way of thinking that figuration can be a vehicle for this kind of societal or ideas, no?
When I was researching for our conversation, I came across a video that was a walkthrough of the retrospective in Monterey last year, and it was amazing because it went from one room full of amazing artwork to another room, and like, just when I'm like, well, surely we're at the end, there's another room, and each room looked completely different, but there was the thread that was tying it all together are these issues that were kind of at the center of who you are. But it just struck me just how much work you make. Are you a restless person? I mean, is it daily? Is it nonstop? What is your practice like?
Well, like they say that if you like what you do, you're never gonna work one day in your life. So it doesn't feel like work. I am actually like having a kind of anxiety attack because I've been 2 weeks in LA and I can't stop to be back in this. Like can't help to want to go back to the studio because that's where I am most happy. Like I really, like I am. I want to go back to the projects that we're developing, etc. So yeah, I mean, the motivations are, there's a lot of it's strange because like sometimes I feel that there's a kind of some part of the practice that is seen, and then I think that then it's going to be very hard to explain how can I be working in these different registers and the different materials and styles, and it feels a little bit that multiple personalities, like a kind of a sort of schizophrenic. But I don't know, maybe ultimately perhaps people join the dots. I certainly feel that it's hard for oneself to feel full congruence. Oftentimes, not even like but happily, I think that people read some congruence from outside because like in my inside it's like I think that I'm all over the place. But is yeah.
Well, Pedro, I really appreciate you being willing to sit down and talk about your artwork and these issues. I'm a fan of nuclear nonproliferation, and I think we'd all love to see an end to violence. And I wish you the best of luck with the new show that's up and the impact you're making on society.
Thank you so much, Craig. It was a pleasure to be in your podcast, and I extend my gratitude to everyone who listened.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.